Alrighty, well, welcome to the podcast, Jacob. Really glad you can be here.
I'm glad to be here as well.
Let's dive right in now that we've both watched the 1957 version of A Farewell to Arms. And we're just going to go kind of off of the notes that we took when we watched the movie and talk about what we liked, what we didn't like, and just our overall thoughts and feelings on the movie. So, the first point for me for the film that stuck out to me, and this is, of course, all my opinion, as is all of this. So many might not be happy about this. Many might completely agree. And one of the first notes I took was the romance in the film is just as annoying, uncomfortable, and unrealistic in the film as it is in the book for me.
So I think it's worse in the film, to be honest. Yeah, there's like the first, I want to say it's like the first actor. So it's before he gets injured and goes to the hospital. There's like nothing between them. There's like no relationship. And then all of a sudden they get to the hospital and it's like they're just this thing. And I was like, what?
Oh
So
yeah,
I mean, they don't
it's
build it
0 to
up.
100 so fast. Like
Yeah,
even for the book, it's pretty fast,
yeah,
and
for
there
sure.
isn't a whole lot of substance there either. And it's so because that's literally what I put down in the notes is it's just as annoying, uncomfortable, and unrealistic in the film as it is in the book. It's yeah. I mean, obviously, I'd probably agree with your assessment that it's worse in some aspects, which is impressive.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's that was my first point. So that gives you a general understanding of how the rest of the film went for me. But what was one of the first points that you had?
So to give it something positive, to kind of start out, I'm a big fan of older films prior to special effects, visual effects, where they had to make things real. They had to do it on camera as much as they could, and that tends to give it better aging, in my opinion. When you look back at old movies, the CGI and all that, you can tell it's CGI. It just doesn't
Right.
hold up as well. This film definitely looks and feels old, but it's still, you can see everything going on screen. It looks nice for what it is. I did enjoy the quality of it in that regard and how it all kind of looked on screen. So that's a positive for the film. That was kind of the one thing that I walked in. I was like, at least it looked nice. It wasn't a bad looking movie. So
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually the second point that I had as well. It wasn't all negative for the movie, but that was another thing that I definitely really appreciated as well was not only the cinematography, but like the lengths that they went for the film. That it's a film that I'd never heard of before I'd read the book.
yeah, I know.
And like the amount of extras that they had for so, like the portions where they were doing like the Italian army and they were filming on site in Italy and Switzerland and stuff like that with the original uniforms, with the vehicles and the horses. Like just for those moments, like especially for someone like me that's like a huge history nerd, I'm like, wow, that's when it was like relatively feasible to do that. Because like even perspective wise, it's just kind of weird to even think about that when that movie was filmed, World War I had only been over for 39 years.
Yeah,
So all of that stuff was still readily available. And like I'm sure they probably just gave all the extras like free lunch or something like that.
yeah, they
But
probably
just
didn't get anything crazy out of it.
yeah, the scale of the movie at times is like seriously impressive by any standard. It's like, wow, they at some points really went all in, and I really appreciated that. It made it more immersive, where other points of the movie were just not that great. There were other times like that where I was like, yeah, this is cinema in the 1950s. Like this is what we miss now that I can really appreciate.
Yeah, totally agree with you. I just think I think it lasts better and that it's more believable and feels more real on
Yep.
screen when they do that. And so that was something that I liked about this movie. It was probably the most positive thing because, like, overall, I don't think the production value of the film was bad. I
Hmm.
think the biggest issues I had with it were in the story and how it kind of progressed
Right.
more so than like the acting. I mean, the acting didn't bother me. I didn't think any of it was particularly phenomenal, but I wasn't like annoyed per se by any of the performances on screen. So good. They did a decent job with making the film. They just should have rewrote it before they did. So,
Right, right. Yeah. What was the next point that you had on the film?
so next thing I was looking at on there was we talked about kind of the story progressing at sort of a weird pace, and how like the first act didn't have any of their like relationship. It does in the book, and they kind of cut that parts out. It was
Hmm.
something that I noticed on several occasions where they would cut out moments that were in the book that I'm like, I don't know why you didn't like keep that in. And
Right.
they tended to keep the least interesting parts. And so there's like there's a lot of stuff that is missing, and I wish that they'd kind of saved some of it. It's this weird feeling. So on the one hand, I feel like this movie was way too long. It's like 2.5 hours, I think, if I remember
Right.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it
Which,
was 2 hours and 36 minutes. Yep.
yeah, it dragged on. I watched it in two different sittings because I just couldn't finish it on the first one. And it's that weird thing where I'm like, okay, on the one hand, I feel like it's way too long. On the other hand, there's parts missing from the book that I wish had been in there. So it's like I want more, but I also want way less than
Yeah,
what they
yeah,
gave
yeah.
us.
No, yeah,
So
I completely understand. Yeah, that I think originally, as a lot of the movies at the time obviously had, was an intermission. It was like a 10-15 minute intermission since it is so long. And that even me and my wife talked about that. It's like, yeah, I can understand why this needed an intermission. Like this is intense. Even for 1950 standards, this is a long movie. So, yeah, I agree with elements where there was questionable decisions with what was and what wasn't included from the book,
mm,
where there were just times where like, okay, why do you have this, but then this is missing when arguably that's potentially more important or gives us more understandings of the character than this does. So yeah, agree with you there 100%. Another point that I had that was a positive was I think the tone of the movie generally fits the book pretty well. That was one of the takeaways that I had throughout, that obviously trying to be able to convey a tone from a book into a film can be really difficult to do sometimes. But I think the movie generally did an okay job at that. What do you think about that?
yeah, I think for the most part, it does kind of have, I guess you'd say, some tonal shifts because there's obviously the moments that it's like this is the war part, this is when he's in the action, such as when he gets injured, parts like that,
Hmm.
and then there's parts that it's just the romance. And so you kind of have that slightly different feel. I actually, the movie it reminded me of the most while watching is actually The Sound of Music. It just kind of gave me that sort of vibe. And it kind of did feel, I don't know, it starts out as kind of this very localized thing. And then as you get farther in, as they kind of run away together and you have that aspect of the story, it's kind of like in The Sound of Music where they're leaving. And so it's that change. And I actually think the film needed that. It was really good to see that. The second half of this film was more interesting for me to watch because it's the part of the book that I'm not familiar with. So I don't know how well they did it at portraying it. And so it's kind of interesting because I didn't know how things were going to go,
Right.
which is enjoyable. I like guessing in movies, seeing what's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the other, this is another question I'll have for you. I'll give you my thoughts on this initially too, was the acting. So I didn't really know any of the actors or actresses for this film. I watch probably more older movies than I would imagine most in you and I's generation do. But even then, I had no idea who any of these people were. I'm like, okay, well, that's probably not a great sign. I think the acting at times was okay. And there were other moments where I don't think it was the actors and actresses' fault as much as it was it's like there's not a whole lot they can be given for this. Like the relationship is so basic and so fast that's like even if you're some of the greatest actors and actresses there are, there's only so much you can do with what you're given. So I was trying
Yeah.
to remind myself of that while I was watching it. Like they're not really being given a whole lot to try and make this work, and that some of it truly just doesn't pan out that well from book to film. So in some ways I felt that they were limited, but then there were other times where I'm like, yeah, that probably wasn't the most spectacular acting around. And they also were just way too old. like actually like the actor and act. So the main actress and actor were also in their 30s.
Uh-huh.
And of course the characters in the book are supposed to be in like their early 20s. And that was in a time also, not to roast everyone in the 1950s, but that's when everyone kind of looked a lot older than they were generally, not always, but generally. So that was just, it kind of threw me off from the very beginning that they looked that old because I'm like, well, they really weren't that old, but they seem like so much older in the film in some regards, and that can be a little distracting. But what were your thoughts about the acting?
Yeah, so I think the acting was it's kind of hit or miss. Like I didn't really get ever bothered specifically by it. And I think it's because there were other things about the movie that were bothering me more. So like the acting was not on the forefront of what I was looking at. There were definitely some parts that I was like, yeah, well, I probably could have done without it. Or there's some cheesy moments to it. Um, but overall, it wasn't a bothersome acting thing to me. Like you, I didn't know how any of them were. Never heard of them before. I looked up the names afterwards. I still have no idea who they are. But if I looked what they're in, I might have some clue. Um, but I think they did all right. There's only so much you can do when the movie itself isn't all that good. Like there's very few times where an actor will save a film that's already just poorly put together. So
Right.
yeah, I
Yeah, that's valid. That's very valid. So the last thing that I had, it was really kind of in connection with the book, and I was thinking about it the whole time. And I initially, so it's kind of a combination of praise, but then also like severe criticism for the film was the theme of rain and what was happening with the rain throughout the story, and that the every time it was raining, something bad was happening or was going to happen. And for the most part, the movie did a pretty good job of having that happen. Like when they first meet in the film, it rains.
right.
And then like when he's at the front, it rains and all these other kind of elements of what's happening. I thought they did great. But then at the one part where it was most important for there to be rain is the very end after Catherine dies and after the baby has died and he's walking home. It's supposed to be pouring rain. And
And
now
they
I know
don't
that
have
like they were
rain at
actually
all.
and they were filming on location, so it's not as if they can like snap, have nature do its work. But I know that Hollywood had the capability to kind of create rain at the time for like really big films. Obviously, like Singing in the Rain is the very first thing that comes to my mind. Like that was done in a studio, but it looked like it was actually raining. So I'm thinking, okay, like this is one of the most important elements of closing out the book properly because it ties everything else together. And you can tell it had just rained and was raining earlier when they were shooting it, and then it had stopped raining. And that was just so jarring to me because I knew how important it was to kind of tie everything back together and was one of the deeper elements of the book that once it was ending, I'm like, oh gosh, I kind of want my money back. Like it's supposed to be pouring. Like he's supposed to be walking and just getting drenched as he just kind of walks off into the distance when the book ends. And I just thought that was a really big missed opportunity that even for the technology at the time, they really shouldn't have whiffed on.
For sure. And speaking of the ending, so I didn't finish the book right before I saw the movie.
Right.
No idea how it ended.
Oh
That
yeah.
was such a bummer. I mean, like I I I get some movies have kind of really unfortunate endings, but I typically prefer a little bit more of a positive ending to it. And so to have it go through this whole thing, and it's not
Oh,
like I was really rooting for their relationship the whole time.
right,
It
right.
wasn't all that great, but to see both lose both of them at the end, I mean, that's such a down way to end a movie. And so I get, it sounds like that was how the book ended. Is that correct?
Yep.
So, I mean, hey, accuracy is what I'm all for as well. So that's great for that. But man, would I would have liked to have seen at least a little bit of a positive ending to it. The book I have actually, the copy of it, I haven't looked through them because I didn't finish it yet. But there's a bunch of like alternate endings at the
Oh
end
yeah. Yeah,
of
that's the
different
version that I
versions.
have as well. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, did you look at any of those? Is that
I
because I know
did. I
there were
didn't
some.
extensively, but I did for a few, and there were a couple where I'm like, this would have been, oh, interesting.
Uh,
This might have been a little, yeah, I didn't read all of them, but yeah,
yeah.
they're I can understand why he had so many while he was writing it, and I really wish he would have expounded in some setting why he chose the ending that he did. But I don't think we'll ever know. But yeah, so I obviously so you're kind of currently reading the book now. So the ending was just a complete well, let me ask you this. Was it a surprise in the sense of what happened and how it transpired, or did you kind of have an idea of where things were going?
I had an idea. I vaguely remember seeing, because I did look somewhat through the book before. I think I knew that the baby was going to die.
Mm,
I remember seeing stuff about that. I didn't know Catherine was going to die as well. Um, and so, yeah, once it got as far, we like went and saw her like laying on the bed after. And I'm like, yeah, she's probably going to pass away here, and that's how it's going to wrap up.
yep.
But yeah, I kind of figured that the baby wasn't going to make it through the end. So yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't know specifics about how everything was going to go down.
Yeah, it's brutal. Even though I knew the ending after I'd read the book, like even in the book, it was obviously since that was the first time I was experiencing the story. It's like there's no way. Like I get it. I get it. This is a book about World War I and how war is terrible, and with an author who was an alcoholic who was severely depressed for the remainder of his life to the point that he'd eventually take his own life. It's like, okay, I get it. But there was like an absolute kind of I don't want to say entire darkness, but just nihilism behind the whole book almost. If it's like, what's the point? Like we're all gonna
Yeah.
die anyway. And I think the movie, in some degrees, and once again, something that I can generally praise, it wasn't able to do it just as well as the book did. That I think the book did a much better job of having the foreshadowing and the build to it and kind of the suddenness of everything happening. For the film, I think they did the best they could, but it was still not as powerful as the book was in some respects, but still not any less enjoyable to
Mm-hmm.
process and watch. It's like, oh gosh, tough stuff. So, final question for you to close
Yeah.
things out here. What would you say on a scale of 1 to 10 for the film? What would you give the film?
Mm. So I'm thinking overall, I'm going to lean kind of low. It's not a movie that I see myself ever going back to rewatch. However, I am semi interested looking at some of the reviews I found online. There's like an older version of the movie from like
Yeah,
the 1930s or something
yeah,
like that. It's
yep,
everyone was saying that one's better, so I'm like semi interested in possibly checking that one out. But I'm not going to watch this one. I think there's some good stuff with the production of it overall, other than that fake blood part. I think most of it looked pretty good. The story was kind of choppy, cut out some of the wrong stuff. The relationship really didn't work for the most part for me. So I'm thinking I'm looking at like 4.5 out of 10. I'm gonna go on the lower end there. It's not one I would really recommend. The book
yeah.
I think is worth a read, but the movie I'd say you could skip it.
Okay. All right. Well, the verdict's in. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with me and just having a good discussion about it. And hopefully it wasn't it sounds like it wasn't at least a terrible experience for you. So it could have been worse, but
It could have been. It definitely could have been. Yeah.
but thanks again for coming on and joining me. And like I told everyone, I'll put the links down for your YouTube channel and for everywhere else that we can find you. And is there anything else you want to say before we finish things out?
Just thanks for having me. It's a good time.
Perfect.